Hello, and welcome to the next episode of the Anti-contractor Home Podcast. I'm Chance.
And I'm Belinda. In this podcast, we try to talk about different aspects of building a home, and we try to find a way that would be the most DIY friendly or the most anti-contractor friendly, something that's low maintenance, easy to construct over its lifespan.
In the last episode, we talked about wood framing construction, which is widely used in the States. Mm-hmm. And today we're going to look at an alternative method, which is steel framing. In general, steel versus wood for home construction, what are the major differences between the two, just in terms of material?
The first thing you think about is cost.
Cost? Okay,
Yeah.
I would think about strength. I mean, steel is used in high-rise commercial buildings.
Yes.
Steel is used in the tallest building in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is the strongest material pound for pound
Yeah.
there is out there. Now, that may seem like a little bit overkill for your house, but it's not as uncommon as you would think.
Yeah.
It is used, and more people are exploring different ways to use steel construction in residential.
In areas like Chicago, they use more steel than here in Texas.
I would think in areas like California because of seismic.
Areas with difficult terrain too, like sloping areas and all that.
Why is
they
that?
tend to, because it's more stable. Your home is more stable.
Like
structure.
we said, steel is very rigid, very strong. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, it's also very expensive. It is 100% recyclable, though.
It is. And it's also made of, when you actually buy steel, it's made of about 20 to 30% post-consumer recycled steel.
Okay,
Yeah.
So they're recycling 100% of it, but they're not reusing 100% recycled steel to make steel?
Mm-hmm. When you talked about the wood construction last week, we said, okay, you have your concrete slab on grade or whatever slab you do have, and then you have wood 2x8s or something that are screwed into your slab, and then you build from there. So steel, it's a different method of construction. It's a little more similar to timber framing than stick framing in that sense, because you start off with these primary solid hot rolled structural members, square tube or wide flanges, whatever, making your primary frame, and then you build from there, which is a similar technique to timber framing.
Okay, so think about a timber frame, the big 12 by 12 Douglas fir you have, and then the rest of your walls are being framed out with stock lumber.
Yes.
So in the sense, steel uses these primary members, these large wide flanges or steel tube, and then to frame out the rest, not interior partitions, but to frame out even the exterior, for example, for windows and for doors, you use a lighter gauge steel. I hate to use the term lighter gauge steel because light gauge steel isn't actually a thing.
So gauge refers to the thickness of the metal, the steel.
Right. The lower the gauge, the thicker the material.
It's inversely proportional. For example, so an 18 gauge C channel, a steel C channel, is thicker and it's load bearing and it can be used on your exterior walls as structural support compared to a 24 gauge C channel that you use in your interior partitions that are just framing out your walls. They're not carrying any load and they don't have any structural capabilities.
But they're sufficient for interior partitions.
Yes.
Similar to your 2x4s for your interior walls.
Yes. You wouldn't use that on your exterior walls. You'd use a 2x6 or a 2x8 or something.
But those interior partitions for wood can be structural, right?
They can. Yes.
They're so stronger than the interior partitions for steel, that light gauge steel.
Yes. Like this wall right behind us over here, that is structural. Designing a steel stud home, this wall right behind us would probably not be structural.
And that's one of the advantages with the steel construction is you have this large open span because of those rigid hot rolled members, those wide flanges that create your frame, and it gives you a wide open interior space. It's an open plan. You can do what you want with it.
It's like the home that you dreamed of as a kid.
I used to have a weird dream where I would go into this massive open building. I mean, I'm talking huge, like as big as a Walmart or something. And
was stocked with toys.
The kitchen was just like on the opposite end, and I don't know why I had this dream. And there was carpet on the ground too. That didn't make much sense. But that wasn't necessarily a steel building. But in order to build something like that, you would need steel.
Yes. You didn't know the specifics of it, but you wanted a big, wide open space.
Yes. As architects, we really like the idea of an open plan. I mean, that goes back to the modernist concepts, Le Corbusier, things like that, where you have this free plan to do what you want. And especially since we want to finish out the interior of our house, we may not have every component designed at the beginning. We just sort of want an open frame building that allows us to expand any way we want.
So we should probably tell people we started looking at plots of land because we don't want to just talk about building this anti-contractor home. We actually want to follow through with it.
Yeah, we are doing something.
Yeah. So there's one plot of land that we looked at further north of where we live in Little Elm. We were looking at the requirements of building a home over there. And they said that from the time you pour your slab to the time your home is waterproof, weatherproof, it has to be 6 months. So for us, if we pour our slab and have this idealistic metal building done in 6 months, then we can do whatever we want to the inside after that.
Right. Yes, you can get around that building requirement.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of construction techniques that can get done that quick, but there are so many of these, this may be jumping ahead a little bit, but there are so many of these packaged kits from these steel companies that will just send you all this material prefabricated, pre-welded together and everything. All you have to do is bolt it together and stand it up. And you can do it yourself, but some of these members are very large,
heavy.
And
it's the hot rolled stuff. That's what's really heavy. The light gauge steel members, whether it's for the exterior walls or even the interior walls, that can be handled by a single person.
Right.
But the wide flanges and the columns and stuff, that's you need a crane or to stand that up.
It's kind of weird, the light gauge steel stuff. It makes me think that people were just looking for an alternative for stick framing. Mm-hmm. And they said, hey, let's do the same exact thing as stick framing, but let's use steel. And I'm sure there's some steel purist out there that are like, don't replicate stick framing. Just use this rigid frame you have on the outside and then come up with a different technique for your interiors. But everybody wants to mimic stick framing, I guess, since it's the most common, most understood technique. Yeah. So the general makeup of this primary framing, the parts and pieces are these main columns. You have rafters. You have roof purlins, which is what your sheathing attaches to on your roof, and you have floor joist for your floors. Mm-hmm. So that's the basic kit of parts for primary construction. Yeah, before you get into finishing out your windows and doors and your interior partitions.
So then after those primary members comes the secondary members, which are slightly thicker C-channels, usually 6-inch by 8 foot tall, 18 gauge galvanized steel.
In which those technically can carry a load. They're not necessarily having to because of the primary structure, but those are things you would use to frame out your windows and your doors.
Correct. The exterior doors.
Yes.
To your home.
Yes.
Yeah, we're still talking about the outside. So those 6-inch members, it's not like wood. Like your nominal dimension is your actual dimension. If it's a 6-inch C-channel, it's a 6-inch C-channel. Like a 2x6 piece of wood is actually 5.5 inches.
But lots of times they'll fabricate them in a way that they mimic stock lumber.
Do they?
Yes.
Oh, that's
like if you look at like I said, it's they're just trying to mimic stick framing.
Yeah.
Really. But it's because we work in these building construction uses these specific dimensions. I mean, let's say you wanted to use a combination of wood and steel. Well, if you had an actual 6-inch stud and then you wanted to put a 2x6 in there, it wouldn't be the same size. As far as exterior, the heavier gauge, the 18 gauge stuff, they may not make it in like a 5.5-inch thickness, but I know for the light gauge, the 22, 24 gauge stuff.
3.5 inch.
Yes,
So I said those are around $10 each. Now compare that to a 2x6.
2x8. Yeah.
2x6, 2x8. That's 8 foot long.
$3.50 to $4.
So a third of the price.
For a 2x6.
Yeah.
But again, steel is stronger. Maybe you have to use less of those. For example, you could span a longer distance between your studs. Maybe it doesn't
24
have to be
inches.
16, 24 inches. It could be 36, 48. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you just have to have it where you have your windows framed or your doors framed.
So what about the insulation in between these C channels?
For exterior, your exterior wall?
So we talked about batt insulation, which you can usually buy in 24-inch pieces because they make it so you can put it in between these studs.
Yeah.
So if you buy 24-inch batt insulation, you still have to space your studs at 24 inches.
And insulation is a whole nother factor that you can get into when it comes to steel framing, because you have to consider steel is a conductor. It's more of a thermal bridge than wood is. Think about in cold weather, if you were to go outside and touch a piece of steel, it's cold, like a handrail or something, it's cold.
Yeah.
Versus wood, if you touch that in the cold, it's not as bad.
So we talked about primary members, secondary. Now we'll discuss the tertiary members, which are the really light gauge steel components. They're very, very flimsy. They're about 20 to 24 gauge steel, U channels and C channels.
The thing about it being really lightweight is that it's super easy to construct.
A single person can hold,
yes.
You can hold several of them.
Yeah, it's a DIY friendly thing.
It is.
In that sense. Not that 2x4s are that heavy, but it is much heavier than a light gauge steel.
Yeah, and it's more forgiving too, light gauge steel.
Than wood?
Than wood.
That's one thing we didn't mention about steel, is that it doesn't warp and bend like wood will over time. Steel stays in place. It is what it is.
And when it arrives to a job site, all these cold form members are perpendicular. Everything is perfectly straight. The hot formed members can sometimes have variations in them. These wide flanges, they're formed when the metal is molten. So as it cools down, it can slightly deform. So it's not as straight as a cold form member.
That's interesting, because those are the members that are prefabricated that you're placing your anchor bolts on your slab for.
Yeah.
And if any of those dimensions are incorrect, then you have a real big problem.
Yeah. But the holes are drilled after the member is formed.
The hole into the steel.
Yes.
Yeah, but your anchor bolts are placed first.
Yes.
Yeah. And the variations are going to be very minimal. I mean, especially compared to wood.
Yeah.
Wood has a lot more creep.
So I looked at Home Depot, and you can buy this at Home Depot and Lowe's. You don't necessarily have to go to a steel supplier. They're about the same price, and they're about the same quality as well. Those members are 3 5/8 by 1 1/4 by 10 feet, 25 gauge steel, and that's around $5.5.
Which is about double the price of a 2x4. And there's a lot of sources out there that say steel framing is cheaper than wood.
And we can't figure out why. I guess if you take all the other things into consideration, like how many of the wood members come to your site that are warped that you have to dispose of, or that you have to replace over time because they get rotten, that's not going to happen with steel.
Yeah.
So if you take all that into consideration, maybe, but just the members itself, those are definitely not cheaper.
Yeah, just one steel stud versus one wood stud. Steel's more expensive.
Yeah.
Straight up. It's kind of like looking at solar panels. It's cheaper, what did we say, 8 to 10 years to pay off.
Yeah.
But steel is a choice that you make. I mean, you have to be all in for it. You have to understand the benefits of steel.
You're talking about specifically for home construction.
Specifically
because when
for
it
home
comes to a
construction.
warehouse or an office building or something, it is obviously the best way to go.
It's the cheapest and sturdiest for the size.
Yeah. So the method of construction is slightly different than wood. They obviously had to mimic the way wood was done, but it's slightly different. So you have U channels on your top.
This is specifically for the interior partitions, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Light gauge steel. So you have U channels on as your top members and your bottom members, like attaching to your concrete and then attaching to whatever your roof structure is. And so those U channels only have a web or a face and then flanges on the side. And then your vertical pieces are C channels. So they have a slight lip in addition to the web in the sides. And those are about the same price as a U channel, $5 each, 5.5. When you use wood pieces, you just have a miter saw cutting them up, just a really simple thing. But when you have these steel pieces, there are lots of different methods you can use. You can either use snippers and then like bend it and then it snaps, or you cut it off, or you can use an abrasive chop saw, which is what we have in the garage right now, the Milwaukee stuff. I wouldn't see us using that for such light gauge steel.
That's unnecessary.
That's
yeah.
unnecessary. That would be for the thicker outdoor stuff. But it is very, very flexible, not like wood. And sometimes like we've watched YouTube videos where people actually reinforce these with wood, which seems
in order
silly.
to frame out a door, a cased opening of some sort.
Or to put up cabinets or something. Instead of using extra steel to reinforce those walls, they just use wood to reinforce the walls.
And so that goes into how you fasten these interior partitions together. You use what are called self-tapping screws, and those hold the pieces together, and they actually hold your drywall onto the light gauge steel as well. They can't handle as much weight as something like a
2x4.
2x4 of wood.
Yeah. Wood.
There's just this feeling of strength that you get whenever you're screwing in a screw into wood. I mean, it's pulling the pieces together. Mm-hmm. Whereas with steel, you're using the self-tapping, and I hear that it takes a while to get the technique down of how to insert these self-tapping screws. So, but it's a cheap, relatively cheap, and lightweight, DIY-friendly way of doing interior partitions. You have to be cognizant of what you're putting on your walls. Like if you're going to mount a TV or something, you need to reinforce it with wood or come up with some other technique.
Or you can use structural steel.
You can use a heavier gauge steel,
yeah,
which is more expensive, and it's not something you can go buy at Home Depot. So one of the advantages of steel that a lot of people like to bring up is the fact that termites don't eat steel. No bugs eat steel. So if you build your house out of steel, you're termite free. You're good. But then you find people who do this hybrid system. They do steel and then they'll do wood on the interior or something, or steel and wood combination. And it's like, but why are you doing that? Why don't you just stick to one or the other? If you want it to be termite free, just stick with steel. If you're going to compromise and use wood, then it's cheaper just to do the whole thing out of wood. There's a lot of extra steps to think about it. I mean, if you're using that light gauge steel stuff on the interior, you have to fully commit to it. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of what you found of this historic
Lustron
home. Yeah, this thing called the Lustron house,
So Lustron house is very, very cool. At least we think it is.
Yeah.
So post-World War II, there was a severe housing shortage in the States. All these people were coming back from the war and they didn't have houses to live in. This guy, Carl Strandland, he designed these homes that were made completely of steel. And it was clad with these porcelain enameled steel panels, both on the outside and the inside, the ceiling, everything, all steel. And it was all prefabricated, brought to the site, and assembled in a couple of days.
This was one of the many attempts at building this prefabricated modular home that was very, very popular in the 1940s, this modernist movement, this Le Corbusier thing.
What was that catalog home? Was it Sears? That catalog, you could buy a home from a book?
I think so, in the Sears catalog.
Right? Yeah.
But that was, like you said, that was because of all the soldiers coming home from World War II. They needed a place to live. So there was this massive housing shortage.
Yeah.
And the Europeans made many attempts at this modular housing, and now you find these buildings are in derelict condition.
Well, actually, they're not. They planned on doing it on a large scale. Obviously, they had these big plans, but they eventually just built 2,500 homes, and they're all still standing. They're very, very low maintenance. We watched some videos of the people who still live in them, and they say it's noisy because the doors are made of metal, everything's steel. Metal, everything's steel. It's noisy, but it's very low maintenance. That's the common denominator. That's the common thing that all of them said.
Yeah.
But they have started demolishing some of it, and that's for a different reason. Not because they were falling apart, but because unfortunately people want larger homes.
And these were prefabricated. They were stuck to a specific size, and that size in the 1940s is not comparable to what people's small homes are of the 2020s.
Families have gotten smaller, but homes have gotten much larger.
Suburban sprawl. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the Lustron home. Very fascinating to me. It's really cool. I'd love to see one of those houses in person, actually.
Just have to go to the north. It's in Chicago. Many of them are Chicago and
there's what was the specific place in Chicago?
Lombard, Illinois.
Really close to Chicago. Mm-hmm. So let's go down the list of all the advantages, not all of them, but the main advantages that people will bring up when it comes to steel construction.
It is DIY friendly to a certain extent compared to wood because easier to carry by yourself, like we mentioned, obviously.
It's always sold as a kit of parts, it seems. I guess you would go to a steel supplier and it's a pre-engineered system. So you have an engineer design your house, and the structural capabilities are of the steel. It's not like you go to Home Depot and you buy your wide flanges and everything and you assemble it all together. So there has to be a lot of thought put into it up front.
Yes. And that's also because there are not many house contractors out there that are trained in building these steel homes. There are a lot of them trained in wood construction because that's
like
a popular
thing.
thing.
80% of the houses in America are wood construction.
Yeah. So it's hard to find trained contractors. So I think that's why, to fill that gap in the market, there are many kits available that you can buy.
And so it's lightweight. It doesn't move. It doesn't warp. It is 100% recyclable.
It's a third of the weight of wood.
It's a third of the weight of wood.
Yeah. And this other thing I found out, so in these C channels that are framing out your walls, they have knockouts in them, as though they're not flimsy enough. You can knock out more metal out of them. But that's a very easy way of passing wires and all through, or even plumbing pipes through your walls.
Mm-hmm. So. The pre-drilled knockouts, yeah.
Yeah. But those pipes and wires can be cut with these metal edges.
Sharp.
So you need like a plastic piece that you put on either side of those cutouts. Yeah, like a sleeve.
Yeah, so that makes me wonder about steel construction. Two things. One is metal wires in your house. Like, is there a potential for electricity to transfer into the steel columns, your beams and things like that? I mean, isn't that a major risk?
No, that's a myth.
It's a myth.
It's a myth.
Okay.
Because it's just like, remember when we were changing out all the outlets and there was a tiny little hole in our insulation and the wires were touching each other, the breaker automatically just tripped. Because
it saw that spike in amperage.
Correct. So if that had to happen with the metal construction, it would automatically trip. So it's a myth that your house can have electricity running through it. But we're not going to have anything running through our walls, right? We want everything on the outside, in conduit, everything accessible.
Yeah, because if you have that cut in your insulation, then you got to figure out where it is.
Yeah.
Or else you can't ever get your electricity to turn on because your breaker's constantly tripping.
That's true.
And the other concern is it's with technology is Wi-Fi. A lot of people say that there's interference when it comes to steel.
That's another myth.
Yep. Okay.
It does not block any Wi-Fi.
But the internet said it.
Nope, that's a myth. It doesn't, really. It's a myth. Those two things that you mentioned.
I've read contrary.
No. An Australian guy on YouTube told me it's a myth.
Oh, okay. The Aussies are usually right. And so we discussed it's much stronger. Especially in an area like we are, Tornado Alley. If you were to have a steel frame building and you suffered a tornado coming through, then your structure would probably still be standing. It's pest proof, rot proof, fire proof, like you said. So we discussed some of the advantages of steel construction. What are some of the disadvantages?
Cost, which we've talked about several times in this podcast.
Yeah, straight up raw material cost. It also has to be, for those primary members, those wide flanges, it has to be an engineered system. You have to have an engineer sign off on it, which a lot of these companies, these steel building companies, will provide you with a set of drawings that have been stamped by an engineer. But that's an extra consideration you have to have. It has to be... You have
to have it thought out completely before you start.
At least the exterior footprint of your house. Yeah. And most of these kits are usually rectangles.
Yeah.
X by Y. It's 60 by 100. It's
which is what we
20
want.
by 40. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with it. Now, you may have... The constraint is your site. Your site may not be big enough. You may have setbacks in that area. You may have to have some sort of jog in your house for a septic tank for a dispersion field. Ideally, you have a big slab and you put a massive box on there and you're good to go.
Yeah.
But there's also building restrictions to consider.
So the site that we're looking at right now, they have a restriction on the exterior finishes that you can use. It has to be plaster. Can't even be CMU.
It has to be 70% masonry.
Yeah.
Which they allow stucco, which is frustrating. Why? Why must you make us decorate our house with something that is not actually what it is? That's the point of the anti-contractor home, is it's a museum of your house.
Yeah. We're not trying to hide anything.
We want people to know how it works.
Yeah. So another disadvantage is fewer trained contractors. This is where the kit of parts comes in. We have something designed previously, not on the site, and you just assemble it on the site by yourself because you don't really have contractors knowledgeable about steel construction.
From what I saw is that you can do it yourself, and you can have as little as 3 people doing it. And I guess this all depends on the size of your metal building. You can have as little as 3 people doing it in 5 to 7 days, and you get your exterior frame completed. Yeah. Now, can you just go hire Joe Blow off the street and get him to? I mean, because all you're doing is bolting pieces together. Potentially one of the advantages, because if you hired 10 people to build your stick frame house,
it wouldn't
take one day.
Yeah.
But you also consider the prefabrication time and the lead time.
Yes.
To get to there.
Do that.
And as we mentioned, another disadvantage is the insulation concern, because steel.
Yeah, I don't think that's as big of a deal as we think it is, because you can clad it on the exterior with what they have. They have reflective foil insulation. This is the same website, Kodiak Steel Homes. They got a very thorough explanation of their steel home kits. They talk about the framing, this primary framing, secondary framing, interior framing, their roofing system, siding, insulation, gutters, everything. They provide a reflective foil insulation for both walls and roof of all their steel homes. It consists of thin blankets which are installed between the frame and the outer wall. So it basically wraps your entire home. And they claim it's really effective.
You could also use more traditional techniques like SIPs or something.
I know this is an insulation podcast that we're going to talk about later. But these reflective panels, they're made of aluminum foil, which reflects 97% of the radiant heat. You can use a fiberglass insulation. So I don't think that the transfer of heat and cool air through these metal panels is a big concern.
Okay, that's all how you insulate your house, which is, like we said, something we'll discuss later. In general, if you were to look at the cost of just the material for a 60 by 100 metal building, 6,000 square feet.
Ooh.
In Dallas, it's about $27,000 for all that.
Wow.
Which seems pretty cheap.
Yeah.
Now, that's not including the slab. That's not including labor to erect it. But hey, you could just do it yourself, right? The cost differs depending on your location, because you have to consider things like snow load and wind load and seismic, things like that. But in Dallas, in our area, it would be roughly $27,000 to get 6,000 square feet of metal building, which seems super cheap.
Yeah.
Now, throw in cost of labor,
insulation,
extra openings, doors, windows, insulation, finishing out your house. It's going to be much more expensive, but that cost also doesn't include shipping.
Well, if we probably have find a steel manufacturer in Dallas, then
which the source that I found
was actually based in Dallas.
That gave me this quote was out of Denton, Texas, which is just north of Dallas.
Ooh. And
so the shipping could potentially be not too bad.
Very minimal.
Just breaking down some of the cost for a steel building, it's about $79 per square foot for the material. It's about $5 to $6 for a 4-inch concrete slab, and it's about $3 to $5 for labor to erect it and things like insulation. In total, it's about $15 to $20 per square foot to erect a metal building.
Okay.
And so, if you were to compare that to wood, how much, like a typical stick frame construction, how much would that differ?
So comparing that to wood construction, stick frame typically costs around $7 to $16 per square foot. That's a pretty big range, but it can be around $3 to $6 for material and $4 to $10 per square foot for labor.
So on the high end for stick frame, you're looking at the low end of steel frame.
Correct.
You have to consider the long-term benefits of steel framing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, last week we mentioned if only there was a solution that was like timber frame, but the cost of a stick frame.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess we still haven't found something that is comparable in terms of cost as a stick frame would be.
Yeah. And maybe a hybrid form is what we need to look at.
With steel and wood?
Steel and wood, or even concrete that we're going to be discussing next week.
Yeah. I'd like to be a purist and go either like all wood or all steel.
But we have to look at it in terms of what's most DIY friendly, most long-term, the long-term thing.
Yeah.
And maybe having a single system for the whole building is not.
That's true. Maybe your exterior is one and your
anti-contractor.
interior is something else.
Yeah.
I think in these few episodes of the podcast we're doing about your structure of your home, we're looking at exterior framing in general.
Yeah.
Interior, it can be its own thing.
And this has been educational for us too, because so far whenever we talk about metal building, just our architecture mentality, our architecture background, we've been more attracted to that than a wood framing. Doing this podcast and finding out all this extra information about cost and feasibility of constructing a steel home has made us realize the disadvantages of it and the advantages of wood construction.
Yeah, I mean, I used
We're more
to
educated.
absolutely despise wood construction from an architect standpoint. I mean, all the buildings that we design in architecture school are
Hypothetically metal buildings.
they're just concrete walls
yeah.
that go all the way up to the sky. It's unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's more about form. It's more about what the spaces are. As we look into this, it's really nice to say, hey, stick framing's not so bad. But we've talked about wood. We've talked about steel. Now, next week, I'm excited to discuss concrete, the architect's dream, right?
Yeah.
So join us next week as we delve into concrete constructions for home.
Until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.